All right, welcome everybody to another Cloud Institute webinar. My name is Jeff Fudge. This is the second webinar I'm doing for the Cloud Institute, so I thank them for allowing me to speak on something I'm very passionate about, which is cloud security. So this is all about unlocking the secrets of cloud security and maybe more specifically, why it's so challenging to secure the cloud. My background has been on corporate IT. I've been a director of infrastructure, CIO, CTO. I've been responsible for billion-dollar PCI environments when it comes to compliance and security. I've also migrated 3 or 4 companies to the cloud, both Azure and AWS, as an IT leader. And now in my roles as solution architect, I help companies that are moving to the cloud and want security baked in. And I also work with companies that are already in the cloud and help them become a little more secure in the cloud and follow best practices. So most of what I'm talking about today is based on my own experiences and what I see in the industry. First, we're going to talk about the current state of the cloud security, and I'll give you a hint that we're not very secure, and you can tell that by the number of compromises that are happening. I'm going to talk about really the differences that I've experienced and that exist between the way on-prem security, specifically infrastructure, technology security is handled on-prem versus how it's typically being handled in the cloud. We're going to talk about the challenges that I see that companies face when they try to get more secure in the cloud, ways to improve, and then lastly, some predictions. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in chat. We'll either get them while I'm speaking or we'll save those to the end. But if you have a question on any topic as we go along, please enter that into the chat. I always like to show a cartoon, and I thought this one really was applicable because the message here is it doesn't matter how much technology you have. It mentions firewalls, encryption. Security vendors are already rolling out Gen AI and have always been using machine learning for at least the 8 or 10 years of baking machine learning into security. But at the end of the day, a lot depends on us as individuals, us as humans, us as cloud engineers. And so the best tool in the world is of little value if it's not implemented correctly. And we'll touch upon that aspect of security as we go along. So here I make the statement, the public cloud is vulnerable. 80% multiple, I've seen this stat provided by multiple security companies, but 80% of all security exposures today are found on cloud, which means 20% are on-prem. And so what that means is the cloud is easier prey. And I'm going to talk about some of those challenges. But yes, the cloud might be insecure out of the box if you don't have any resources in it. AWS, Microsoft, Google run very secure data centers, but it's up to us, the engineers, the architects, the system integrators, and consulting companies that build those environments. You can choose to be secure, or you can choose to not use a firewall. You can choose to have public IP addresses on vulnerable websites. So at the end of the day, we own the responsibility to make sure our applications are secure, while the cloud providers make sure that the data center and the hardware is secure. The average cost of a data breach now is 4.8 million, as IBM has indicated in a lot of their disclosures. What's interesting, as I've spoken to a large number of companies about the cost of security, it's often an item that, oh, we don't have any budget for that. And yet, if you get compromised, obviously the reputation risk, maybe the increased cost, the cyber insurance, you're typically down for a number of hours, if not days. I've been around helping a Fortune 500 company out that was down for weeks, costing them millions of dollars easily each day. And so it's always an interesting dilemma. Well, we'll find the money if we have to once we get compromised, but we don't have the money today to help secure our environments. Another stat here is 20% of companies have experienced a public cloud incident. Now, that might mean that it's a SaaS, they're using a SaaS solution. That might mean they're in Google, Azure, AWS, but it's just going to become more and more commonplace, I think. And we'll talk about the reasons there. I think the pace of innovation is really at breakneck speed right now. And so I think that's causing people to implement solutions long before they're secured. This is less so Fortune 500 enterprise class companies with thousands of employees. This isn't usually true, but I do see this a lot in the small to mid-sized businesses, the SMB segment, the mid-market segment. And I know this to be true because I've been there myself working for some of these companies. 80% of companies don't have a dedicated cloud security team or someone to lead. And we're going to talk about shared responsibility and my thoughts on that. But to me, that's a scary statistic, especially in this day and age. Only 20% of companies measure their security posture in real time. And as someone who has set through a lot of security audits, PCI, pen testing, a lot of companies, instead of measuring how they are today or any given point in time, they wait till the next audit. They wait for the next annual audit or for someone to require an audit to take place. And so that's a scary statistic because typically these cloud environments aren't very static. Changes are being made, sometimes weekly, sometimes monthly. But if you're not always measuring your vulnerabilities in the cloud, you're just really asking someone to get lucky, find your public IP address, and break in. So I think that's a statistic that hopefully changes over time for the better. And relating back to the cartoon, the human element is responsible for 82% of incidents. So it's sometimes we're not doing security at all. Sometimes we're not doing security the right way. Sometimes we're not doing security enough. We've misconfigured items. We've forgotten to do things. So it's that human element that the best tools in the world aren't going to solve for us. That's just us getting smarter at what we do, getting more dedicated at what we do, and becoming more passionate about securing our environments. So let's talk about some of the differences between on-prem security and what typically happens in the cloud. If you look at on-prem security, whether it's a company's data center, a colo facility, there have been years and years, 10, 20 years of experience of how to lock down and secure on-prem environments. Audits and compliance drives improvement. So you have a lot of continuous improvement year after year. Focusing on a hardened exterior, typically you've got a dedicated security team for on-prem resources. If the company is large enough, they maintain the firewall. And nothing gets added as a firewall rule unless it goes through the security team. Sometimes there's a change review board. Sometimes it's a very formal process. Sometimes it's less formal. But someone is owning the keys to the kingdom. They're managing that firewall. So you've got, basically sometimes a soft GUI inside where things may not be as hardened, may not be as secure, but you've got a gatekeeper keeping that firewall very secure. And you're only going to have access to the internet from your servers on the inside if you can demonstrate a business requirement to do so. And I'll talk about how the cloud is a little different in that respect. Security budget over time has been developed. Companies are typically accustomed to spending money to secure their infrastructure, which is where most of the mission critical applications are running. Sometimes they're in the cloud, but quite often you have at least one, if not more, mission critical applications still running on-prem or in colo facilities. I talked about the tight control. You typically have assigned accountability. We're going to talk about how you may not have assigned accountability for cloud security, but typically you do for on-prem because that's a lot of capital expense. You've spent millions of dollars on hardware, or you're generating millions or tens of millions of dollars with everything that's on-prem. And so you have a budget that is relatively appropriate for locking down your on-prem environment. You know best practices for securing your SAN, for securing your existing web servers. You're using Cisco or Palo Alto or Juniper or F5 or other security appliances. The pace isn't all that fast because you do have to buy capital hardware, you have to rack and stack it. That usually takes months compared to the pace of the cloud. So that's not changing all that often where you're just adding new hardware. You might be adding new virtual servers, but they're still protected within the same security fabric. And that pace is moderate for a number of reasons. But now, and you see this well-fortified castle, now this is how I see time and time again in large companies and smaller companies. It's not quite as secure as we'd all like it to be. And one of the first reasons why that is because the responsibility is shared. And to me, if it's shared, that means it's really no one's responsibility. And so typically you've put your developers or your DevOps engineers and you tell them, hey, you're going to be developing in the cloud a POC, the first couple of workloads or applications. Why don't you learn the cloud, learn about security, learn about cost optimization all at the same time? And it's really tough for the staff because they haven't been trained on cloud security. They don't know the best practices. Another, I talked about the firewall for on-prem. It's so easy in the cloud today to provision a Windows or a Linux server, whether you're going to use IIS or Apache or Nginx, and you can just very easily through a cloud console say, yes, I want to put a public IP right on top of my web server. No firewall, no WAF or web application firewall, no support filtering. It's very easy to violate security best practices. And so you lack a lot of the firewall formality and structure that you had on-prem because it's a small team learning as they go, and because the web console makes it pretty easy to do things in an insecure way. And if you're not measuring your security posture, then you won't know until potentially it's too late. I would say security always runs second fiddle to innovation. Companies are interested in innovation. Let's move to the cloud. Let's do data analytics or a data lake. Let's see what Gen AI is all about, machine learning. We need a new customer application that's really going to set us apart, differentiate us from our competitors. That always has a different amount of passion and energy and budget than security. And security sometimes is, hopefully it's good enough, but companies just don't attack security the same way they tackle innovation. And that's typical in the cloud specifically. I talked about best practices may not be well understood by the engineers, the developers, the DevOps engineers. It's a very fast pace. The cloud allows you to provision with just a few commands at a command line, a Terraform script, whether you're doing it from the console with point and click. It's a very fast pace to put a new server and make that server live. It's a little more involved. It can still be very efficient on-prem with VMware or Hyper-V, but it's a whole different pace in the cloud that makes it easier to forget about security. I see a lot of lack of visibility, whether it's Security Center with Azure Security Hub and AWS. Companies aren't really even using the native cloud features to understand their cloud posture, not because they've consciously decided not to. often it's just a lack of education. But you can't really improve what you don't measure. And if you don't measure your cloud security posture with third-party tools, with cloud native tools, that vulnerability is going to sit out there for a long time potentially. And a false sense of security. I talk to a number of customers and they always say, yeah, but we're not a huge multi-billion dollar organization, so we're just a small fish in the barrel. And my message is always, well, you're a public IP address within the Microsoft Azure range or the Amazon AWS range. You're just one port scan away from potentially being compromised. So it's true, if you're not a large, well-known company, they're probably not running intelligence gathering on you, but there's a lot of so-called script kiddies or people running vulnerability scanning tools to try to find an open port, an open 3389 for RDP for Windows access, port 22 for SSH access. If you ever want to find out how insecure the cloud can be in a safe account environment, create a Windows server, open up 3389 to the internet, which is RDP. Don't change the default admin account name. Give it an easy all text password and see how long before your Windows server gets compromised. I've done that test before and it took less than 24 hours and someone owned the server. And I had to do that to convince the board of directors and the CEO, this is what happens if you are not secure. So all of these challenges work together to create the cloud security environment which we have today, which is pretty much leaving your front door open and hoping no one drives by to see that they have easy access into your house. So why are we making it so easy for hackers? Let's kind of dig in for some of these reasons and do a little deeper dive. This is the typical cloud timeline that I see time and time again. You start out with a pilot project. Hey, let's try out Azure or GCP or AWS. Security isn't a big deal when you do your first pilot application, your first proof of concept. Typically, it's not a production workload. Maybe it's a dev test environment that you're putting up there. Companies rationalize, well, there's no sensitive data, there's no production data, so we'll worry about security when we go live. But then sometimes if the POC is successful, the company's like, wow, that's great, we have to go live, let's work on the second application. And then security, which was supposed to happen between piloting and the prod go live, doesn't happen. They add more applications. At some point in time, someone is going to get nervous or they're going to get an email that says, hey, have you measured your security? Or there's going to be an audit. But the security focus is sometime after they've already had multiple production applications in the environment. And I see this working for a cloud partner day in and day out. We really didn't think we were insecure until someone brought something up or we hired someone who said, hey, we need to lock down our cloud environment. So nothing really gets baked in from the start. And when you're going to move to the cloud, the recommendation, the best practice is consider security before you move in. So you wouldn't buy a house and not lock the doors and windows before you put in. I mean, you wouldn't leave those open and just wait until you start moving in furniture. And then at some point in time, you think you have enough furniture to lock people out. The same thing is with the cloud. So my mantra is always bake security in day one, build that infrastructure environment in the cloud, state what your security concerns are, build that security infrastructure, get the tooling, and then start with your POC. Yes, it slows down the POC at first because you're focusing on security, but in the long run, you're going to be in a much safer spot. And most of us in the industry say it's either pay now or pay later. Pay now, meaning pay for the security tools, do it right the first time, or pay later because you've got compromised, and at that point, it's going to cost you a lot more to fix the damage that's been done. I mentioned you can't improve what you don't measure. And so there's a lot of lack of security posture management. I see that time again on Azure and AWS. It's when I talk to customers, hey, are you familiar with Security Center? Are you familiar with Security Hub, the low-cost cloud posture tool that the cloud providers provide? Are you familiar with open source tools or some third-party tools for security posture management? So this isn't hard to enable. The cloud providers make it pretty easy, but at the same time, it's not in your face. So you can keep provisioning databases and servers all you want. And typically, until you enable the tool, the cloud providers aren't going to stop you from doing things insecurely. It's up to you to make sure you're following best practices. Another one that I see, even if companies are measuring their security posture, is they don't have any threat intelligence. They don't have, in other words, they don't have a cloud service or a third-party tool running to analyze logs to send you an alert to say it looks like you're suffering from a brute force password attack. It looks like you're being attacked by some malicious IP addresses in another country. It looks like you're being attacked by a botnet or a victim of a potential DDoS attack. So if you're on AWS, it's Amazon GuardDuty. If you're on Azure, it's Microsoft Sentinel. There's a lot of third-party tools, but if you're going through the process of logging everything in AWS, it's flow logs for the VPCs. If you're going to log all the activity, you need that threat intelligence to send you an alert that things are out of normal baselines or things that need your attention. Another challenge is companies don't have a security framework to measure themselves against to know, are you secure or not? It's easy if you're a retailer or if you deal with credit card processing, then you've got the payment card industry, aka PCI. If you're dealing with health information, you can use HIPAA high trust frameworks. If you're in a company and you don't have PCI, you don't have HIPAA, but you have PII, personally identifiable information, I would always suggest the Center for Security, CIS. CIS has a benchmark out for all the different cloud providers. They also have benchmarks for operating systems, Windows, and different flavors of Linux. So CIS has a lot of great free resources inside of Security Center on Azure, Security Hub for AWS. You can select typically that cloud's providers best practices and security standards. And then I would say the second one I would use is the CIS. Take the most recent benchmark because that'll support the most number of native clouds services. So it helps to have that framework so you can say, boy, based on CIS or based on Azure AWS best practices, here's my gaps. And then prioritize those gaps and develop a remediation roadmap for yourself. But not only should you turn on some threat intelligence and some cloud posture management, but pick a framework to measure your progress against. It helps to have that target. You may never be 100% compliant. A lot of these frameworks have informational findings that don't present any real risk, but take a look at all the critical and the high security findings and get those remediated. Lastly, I would say there's not a focus on continuous improvement. They implement a tool, everyone's focused on it, they become compliant on a given Tuesday, and then everyone forgets and they fall back to their normal routine, and the gaps and the risks continue to build because customers are using new services. They're putting new servers out there, and maybe they provision it differently than the first time around without all the same security controls or firewall settings. So I would say companies need to focus on its continuous improvement. Are we better this week than we were last week, last quarter, last year? I see a lot of inexperienced staff. I've faced that myself as an IT leader. Managing a staff, we don't always have the budget to hire, high-end, six-figure security experts. And so you see a lot of DevOps engineers, as I've mentioned previously, in charge of security that don't have that training. They don't have the cloud security training. And I'm going to talk about ways to kind of solve this that I think are pretty successful, but they don't have prior security experience. It could be the first time the company's been working in the cloud. So they don't have any Azure or AWS or GCP experience. Everyone has limited time. There's only so much time in the day. And often that's, are we going to spend time doing the strategic initiatives, the things the business is clamoring for and screaming about? Or are we going to try to take some time away and secure our cloud environment? And sometimes that is a tough decision to make when you're being screamed to get things out, and in the back of your mind, you need that inner peace that, hey, we're doing this securely. And so that's a tough bind to be in. Sometimes there's limited interest. Sometimes if you're working on advanced technologies, data analytics, machine learning, Gen AI, um, chat bots, name it. Maybe the cloud is just brand new to you. Anytime I have an AWS user group where I talk about AI, everyone attends. I have one on security. I get about 1/5 the interest. Some people don't find security interesting. And so that is another reason why we don't have the same cloud security that we deserve. And lastly, no accountability. Often I'll ask, so who's in charge of security in your cloud environment? And it's like, well, we all are. And I'll talk about how we get away from that. I think the pace of innovation works against us. I've been around long enough that I remember the waterfall method where you'd be working on application software for months and months and months before it goes live. If you had to order servers, it would take, weeks, if not a month and a half to get them. The pace was just different. The pace now, I worked for a company where we were doing daily sprints. We would make 3 or 4 code changes a day. Now we derived a lot of value from our cloud environment. It was a SaaS business, so the faster we made changes to the environment, the faster we brought in revenue. And so you would roll out enhancements multiple times a day. Now, not everyone is that crazy to have daily or hourly sprints, but it might be a 2-week sprint as opposed to a couple months. So there is a lot of pace. There's a desire to move very quickly from proof of concept, POC to production. Best practices continue to evolve. Every time a new service comes out on AWS or Azure or GCP, there's best practices to be applied to secure that brand new service. And people are always willing to kick the tires and rush it in production, often without understanding the best practices to secure that new service or feature. And the fact that a company hasn't had any kind of prior cloud compromise or on-prem compromise gives them a false sense of security. Same with DR. If you talk to a company that has had to declare a disaster before, you can see a whole different approach in the companies that have never had to declare a disaster. And it's the same thing with security. If you've never been compromised, if you've never had a huge outage that impacted your customers, impacted your business operations, affected your brand and the good brand value that you bring to your customers, you might not think it's as important. So I see a lot of false sense of security out there. And having an assessment tool doesn't always resonate as much as it should, that, hey, that's a real risk that you face, and you're lucky you haven't been compromised before. Overly permissive policies. I would say on-prem policies tend to be more formal and more structured than what I've seen in the cloud. And in the cloud, it's often, boy, what's the path of least resistance? I've got to create roles and accounts for 5 people in IT. It's you're an admin or you're not an admin. And it's not very granular either. You can do everything or you can do read-only or run applications. And there's a lot of security roles in between those two extremes. And so what I see time and time again, if anyone's a developer, it's even if you're not going to work on the database side or you're not going to work on the analytics side, you're given access to everything, all the data storage volumes. You've got the ability to delete encryption keys, create new encryption keys. So there's not a lot of adherence to least privilege. And on AWS, there's some access analyzer for IAM. I believe Azure has something similar, but there are tools to help you build custom roles for someone who doesn't need access to administer everything within your environment. And the larger your company is, the more cloud accounts you have, the worse the exposure can be if that account is ever compromised. And I worked for a company where we would do dark web searches, and you can find admin logins for Azure and AWS for $5, not protected by MFA on the dark web. So just because you haven't been compromised yet doesn't mean someone hasn't put up your admin login out there waiting for someone to buy it and exploit it out on the dark web. No regular permission auditing. So if you're an admin, you're an admin typically until you leave the company. No visibility to understand how wide a gap they have between what someone needs to have access to and what they have access to today. I mentioned an AWS tool, Access Analyzer, does that for identity and access management. And MFA, something as simple as MFA. It's so easy to implement. Yes, it might be a pain to look at your phone, but the good news is a lot of the cloud providers, for instance, on my Mac, I've got a fingerprint reader. A lot of cloud providers are allowing you to use any kind of um, systems within your laptops, biometrics, whether it's face, whether it's fingertip. You can start using that a lot more than phone, but enable MFA. You don't want your admin credentials to be sold on the dark web because it has an easy to guess password without any MFA protection. I was just auditing a recent company. They'd had MFA on the admins. They also had individuals had the ability to create new logins, but those were not protected by MFA. So if you have any kind of administrative, you don't have to be a global admin. If you have the ability to create users, you don't want that account, that user login to be compromised because they can just create their own accounts and then the exploitation is that much more efficient for them. So those are a lot of the challenges I see. So how do we make this better? And let's talk about that a little bit. I talked about baking in security. In the cloud world, we talk about that being a landing zone, building a well-governed, highly secure landing zone. That's your base infrastructure. That's your base networking. Do that for even a POC or your first pilot. Now, there's different technologies to do that. There's different ways to implement guardrails, which is really what are my security rules that I want all my developers to adhere to. Let me implement those guardrails. If you're familiar with AWS, it's service control policies, SCPs, it's config rules. With Azure, it's probably going to be Azure policy, but you can create an environment that says every time we create a new cloud account, we want the same governance, the same security rules as our existing account. Don't leave it to chance. Don't leave it at the whim of the person creating that new account. If you have it in automation, through Terraform, through CloudFormation templates, through Azure automation, that's great, but you can also bake it into your AWS accounts. So I would say do that. So continually shift left, not and it is important to shift left security from an application development perspective, but also shift left when you're building out your AWS or Azure infrastructure. Think about security from day one before you put your first server out there, before your first customer data hits the environment, and do that early on in your project. As tempting as it might be to do something quickly, no one's going to thank you for doing it quickly if you get compromised. Another way I would encourage companies to make themselves more secure is look at all the cloud native security services. If you're on Azure, Google Azure Security Services, talk to your Azure rep. If you're on AWS, do the same thing from an AWS and Amazon perspective. Familiarize yourself with what you're, and even GCP with Google. What does the cloud provider offer for threat detection? How much does that cost? If you're not going to use it, make sure it's because you made a conscious decision that the ROI wasn't valuable and you accept that risk willingly. Don't do it because it's a lack of education and you didn't know better. So see what's out there for threat detection. Take a look at a security monitoring dashboard such as Security Hub, Security Center. How do you measure yourself against compliance frameworks? What kind of logging is considered best practice? How do you log all the access that all of your users are doing in AWS? How do you log all of the internet access? How do you log all access to databases, error logs, operating systems? Make sure you've got your logging in order. And just as importantly, how do you have alerts configured? So if you're doing compliance monitoring, if you're doing threat detection, make sure your alert is not just being lost in an inbox with 10,000 other alerts. You don't want to be alerted on everything because you then get a little immune to it, but you want to make sure that you are alerting on the right things. Vulnerability scanning is often not enabled. I see companies still running Windows 2008, which has been unpatched for quite some time. You want to make sure that you understand what you're up against. You may decide not to patch it. Maybe you're afraid something's going to break, but at least know whether your operating system is at end of life, your DLLs, your application dependencies. It's amazing how many companies don't realize that when you install something like a third-party library, whether you're doing Linux or Windows environment, if that has a security vulnerability, that can be the open door. It doesn't matter how secure everything else is. Your software has to be secure behind the firewall, but they can still exploit something across 443 or port 80, HTTP or HTTPS. So take a look at the vulnerability scanning, and most cloud providers have that available out of the box. Make sure you're patching, or if you're not patching, you're making a conscious decision not to patch as opposed to you never got around to it. And if you need to, take a look at what's out there cloud native. Cloud native tools and services are never going to be as robust or feature rich as third party. It's going to be cheaper typically than third party. So a lot of companies, especially the larger companies, where your AWS or Azure bill might be $5,000, $10,000 a month. And then you start taking a look at, do I need something more than the cloud native services? Do I need to go with third-party firewalls, third-party intrusion detection? So make that consciously and investigate open source. I'm a big believer in Steam Pipe. Steam Pipe's available for GCP, Azure, AWS, has a lot of modules to help you do compliance benchmarking. You can get a graphical display in your browser, you can get a CSV, you can generate a PDF with a report writer. And keep in mind that there's a lot of open source tools often provided by the cloud providers themselves to report on your cloud security posture. Make sure you train your staff. There's a lot of free online training. Look to YouTube. There's a lot of garbage out there, I admit, but there's a lot of great content. If you want to be trained on AWS security, go to the AWS channels in YouTube. Same with Azure or Google. There's free online training sites. There's paid training sites. There's books online like with O'Reilly. A lot of workshops out there from the cloud providers. Reward security certification. If you want to be security certified, ask your employer, will you pay me to test this? Will you pay me to pass this? They could say no, but I think more and more companies are starting to reward people for being certified in security because it pays off. It's the gift that keeps on giving. Or hire an outside firm. If you're not experts, hire a company that is an expert and request knowledge transfer. You want to assign accountability. If it's a shared responsibility, that means no one thinks that their job depends on them doing that. And that means if they have no extra time for anything, those shared responsibility tasks aren't going to be done. So select someone to be responsible, not a group, not a department. You have to say, hey, the buck stops here, and this person needs to understand that if they're compromised, it's going to be a reflection of their inability to do their job in a reasonable manner. I'm probably using an old idiom here, use a carrot or use a stick. Basically, that means you can send in a positive fashion or you can punish in a negative fashion, but people are often coin operated. If it's not part of their job description, if they don't think it's going to be a negative impact on their career, they're often not going to do it. So just be aware of how you're motivating people to focus on security or maybe ignore security. Make sure you've got the budget for tools, look for continuous improvement. There's always going to be new services out there. Make it a percentage of cloud spend. If you're doing 10x the amount of cloud work this year than you did last year, maybe your security budget needs to be 10x and grow at the same time. You started off simple with security. Now you have more mission critical applications. Fight for that budget. Focus on continual improvement and provide the training that's required. You can't expect people to have a cloud secure environment if they're not trained to do so. Encrypt, encrypt, encrypt. I'm not going to read through this slide, but I've been in IT long enough. People didn't encrypt because it required specialized hardware, because of the overhead, because of the latency. That's not true in the cloud today. A lot of services are now encrypting by default. A lot of times, though, it's still an option. So when in doubt, encrypt. Dev, test, production, it doesn't matter. You're not going to save any time or money by turning on encryption, so I would encourage you to do so. So let's follow up with some predictions. I hate the acronym game. Now everything is CNAP. You don't want to just be Cloud Security Posture Management, CSPM. You don't want to just protect your applications with cloud workload. I believe that is program protection or policy protection. Now it's CNAP, which is everything. So forget the buzzwords and look beyond the buzzwords. What are these tools actually doing for you to improve your security posture? You're going to see a lot more focus on zero trust and identity-based security policies, not let everything in from a huge IP address range from on-prem. Oh, we allow anyone on the corporate network to access the cloud. Now it's going to be, do we allow Susie and AP to get to the cloud? Tommy over in IT, someone in warehousing. You're going to see a lot more focus on the individual identities and groups that they're in, and not just because of their IP address. So you're going to see a lot of cloud providers move into identity-based access through their features and services. I think tooling, a company is going to say, why do I have different tools to manage on-prem security and cloud security? Why can't I have a comprehensive tool that helps me risk rank across both environments? And I've seen cloud environments hacked, which then that compromise moves to on-prem, and I've seen on-prem environments hacked first, and that moves to the cloud. So companies are going to really insist that, hey, I need to understand my security posture in both and how one compromised environment may lead to the other being compromised. Lastly, I'm going to say AI and ML. I'm working with companies now. We were saying, Jeff, we are developing a security posture interface where someone can say, show me my top 3, top 5 security weaknesses in my cloud environment across AWS, Azure, GCP. You're going to see a lot more natural language processing to show what the security risk is, and then what the fix is. They're going to make that remediation of the risk a lot easier through natural language processing. So I'll close with this thought: security is always excessive until it's not enough. No one ever wants to fight for the budget. Oh, we don't need to spend that much. And that's true until you're compromised. And then it's second guessing. So I would encourage any of you that work in IT, work in the cloud, make sure you're fighting for that budget and for using the right tools. And with that, we'll open it up to questions before we close the webinar. Again, if you can post that in the chat, we'll pause for just a minute or two. If you have any thoughts, if you want to share any of your recent experiences, have any anecdotes you want to share, now's the time to do that. All right. Well, I'm the Director of Solution Architecture at JetSweep. I do talk about cloud security, AWS specifically. If anyone ever just wants to link to me on LinkedIn, there's the QR code to my LinkedIn profile. We thank you for joining us here at Cloud Institute. There's a lot of great learning opportunities and coaching opportunities at Cloud Institute. I'll be doing another cloud webinar in September, so don't join just for me. We have a lot of great speakers. We encourage you to reach out to us at sales@cloudinstitute.io. Visit our website, reach out to us. We want to make sure that you are empowered with all the skills and techniques you need to be successful in the cloud. Have a great day, and thanks again for attending.